Hello, I'm Riza. One of the most relevant parts of the Yoga Sutra we can focus on and study is on the concept of Ahimsa, or nonviolence. We can find Ahimsa in the 8 limbs of yoga. It is a yama, or a restraint, a guideline that Patanjali shares with us in order to live our life according to the yogic way. It's in the 2nd chapter, I believe, and it's in the Sadhanapada chapter of the Yoga Sutras. And what does non-violence mean, ahimsa? So does it mean being a vegan? Does it mean letting everybody step on you and never having a voice, or never arguing, or avoiding conflict? Well, in life, sometimes that's impossible. Sometimes one of those things are impossible, or all of them are impossible. And as my teacher Jafar Alexander once taught me, ahimsa is more choosing a lesser violent path in life. So if we have a choice, we can choose to live in a lesser violent way to ourselves and our environment. A good example of this is monitoring our thoughts and our feelings, because violence isn't just a physical act. It could be a verbal act with verbal abuse, right? It could be even a thought that we have, a prejudgment about someone can be a form of violence. So in order for us to work with ahimsa, we really need to understand it and start with our own thoughts. For example, ahimsa can be as simple as you're sitting in a crowded cafe and someone comes to sit next to you and he's speaking loudly and smoking a cigarette. Our reaction is a defense mechanism. We can immediately turn around and say something, or tell them off, or get angry, or let it bother us. Or we can breathe it through and let it go. Take a different approach, a non-violent approach, and have compassion for the person. Maybe they're having a tough day. Maybe they've been smoking a long time as a habit to cope with some darker issues. So when we look at the world with a compassionate heart, with an open heart, in a multifaceted way, when we look at people as we would look at ourselves, then that creates that energy, that acceptance, that love for nonviolence to exist. And so it's quite easy to practice ahimsa. We can also have boundaries. It doesn't mean that we have to avoid or take the lesser road in a conflict. It just means the way that we speak, the way that we present ourselves, rather, the way that we communicate can come from a calm place, a rational place, a loving place, rather than coming from a defensive, angry, ungrounded place, from that big wave of fiery emotions coming out. Sometimes we can take a step back, and that in itself is an act of ahimsa. One wonderful story I once read about was about a famous sadhu that came from village to village teaching, right? A famous monk teaching villagers as he went. And one day he came across a village where the villagers were terrorized by this giant, enormous, scary snake. And so he gently walked up to the snake fearlessly and began to speak about the Yoga Sutras, began to speak about the yamas and ahimsa in particular. And so he left the village that day with peace in his heart. And many years went by, and when he returned to the village, he noticed the town people going all about it. He noticed the snake coiled up, all bruised and broken in a corner. So he approached the snake and asked, "Snake, what's wrong with you? What's happened to you?" And the snake said, "Well, I began to practice ahimsa, like you told me, non-violence. And so the townspeople were no longer afraid of me, and they began to throw rocks at me and torture me. And I was so afraid to leave my den to feed that I whittled away to nothing. And I didn't want to cause any conflict, so I've just stayed here whittling away." So the sadhu said to the poor snake, "I did preach to you about nonviolence, but I didn't tell you not to hiss." And so we can have boundaries as well. We can hold back. We can stay away from toxic people or toxic situations. We can set a boundary to not engage in conflict. And that's a form of ahimsa itself. And so instead of responding to something that bothers us defensively or irrationally with our emotions front and center, we can take a step back and show compassion for the person. Maybe ask ourselves where they're coming from, where their source of conflict is coming from, or why they're behaving this way. And with that, we can approach them in a loving, compassionate way And then we can speak to them in a rational and calm way without engaging in violent talk or behavior. And so life isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about diffusing conflict and navigating our way through them in a non-violent, loving, compassionate way. Thank you so much. I hope this Dharma talk has been useful for you today and serves. Namaskaram.